ora tātou. I was a member of the Commission for the Future for about 3 years from its beginning. Until I read Marilyn Waring's book, The Political Years, I had thought that Brian Talboys, whose Hamilton electorate meeting I had chaired, and whose clear astonishment that a woman was able to do this, had been responsible for my appointment. I now find that Marilyn had advocated my inclusion, with the end result that a previously unnoticed Hamilton lawyer began her odyssey to the future. This evening I'm just going to take you back to those days and reminisce a little. I was completely bewildered, of course, at the inchoate task ahead of me, and to my fellow members that must have been completely obvious. However, I recall some pivotal moments in the Commission for the Future's period, such as the spellbinding speech by Ranganui Walker about the place of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in New Zealand life. That was a novel concept just those few years ago. I also recall Geoffrey Palmer, who had entered Parliament not too many years prior, expressing his enthusiasm for an American-style written constitution and making it clear that once Labour had the political reins of power, it would only be a matter of time. As you will appreciate, many of the issues that we studied have proved to be entirely appropriate. At the time of the massive oil shocks, when the cost of fuel to a small and isolated country had become unmanageable, as Jim Bolger has indicated, there was the beginnings of a debate about the introduction of nuclear power. But from the studies that the Commission did, it was quite clear that the public did not want this. It did not want to assume the attendant risks of introducing nuclear power to New Zealand, and eventually other political decisions made on different criteria excluded that possibility. The future has caught up with me because one of the risks that we studied at the time, apart from climate change, about which we've heard a great deal this evening and which I completely support, not climate change, but the concept that we ought to be studying it, was the risks that New Zealand faces from natural disasters. Currently, I'm conducting an inquiry into the EQC's practices following the devastating Canterbury sequence of earthquakes and other events such as the Seddon earthquake, which so seriously affected Wellington. The analysis of risk is more sophisticated and informed today, but the Commission for the Future's emphasis on this issue was timely, and the establishment of the EQC, much earlier than the Commission, of course, was in itself an acknowledgement of future hazards, at that stage rather unknown, and it was a clear indication of prudent future planning. At the time that the Commission for the Future was in operation, migration was a major concern for all of us. We had extremely difficult employment and economic problems, and so the whole issue of the demographic composition of our population was very much at the forefront of minds. Emigration from New Zealand was building steadily, and we were very concerned about the future economic prospects for the population. Demographic changes in New Zealand's population were extremely difficult to project, and yet the size and composition of our population was a fundamental tool for future planning and a topic on which we focused a great deal of attention. The Think Big projects were also hot news. What sort of future did New Zealanders want? A more industrialised economy, one where we might just be able to withstand the oil shocks and the equally great shock of being excluded from Great Britain's markets when it entered the EEC? Or did we want to preserve our rural economy as our primary industry and source of income? I clearly recall the survey that the Commission for the Future undertook to assess New Zealanders' views on the Think Big projects. The result was clear. We wanted Think Biggish, neither a return to rural life in small communities nor massive industrial projects. Interestingly, though, some of those projects, developed at immense cost, are still productive. Tiwai Point still produces profits for its owners, and the Clyde Dam still produces hydropower and has not yet slipped down the central Otago hills as predicted. Successive governments have grappled with the resulting deficits, and all is well with the world. Personally, I think that the publicity surrounding the Think Big public poll commissioned by the Commission for the Future was the beginning of the end for the Commission, because it was not received well in political circles, as you can understand. Wendy's already indicated that one of the features of the Commission for the Future was its political bipartisan nature. Current members of Parliament, Minister Hugh Templeton and Roger Douglas from the Labour Party, participated fully in all of our meetings, Hugh Templeton writing assiduously in a large diary as we discussed widely varying topics, and Roger Douglas propounding the virtues for New Zealand of a flat tax rate, which I admit at the time seemed an excellent idea to me. I was a lawyer in private practice paying 66 cents tax in the dollar. The Commission for the Future's papers were often met with cynicism, at least by the political class, and I recall vividly contemplating the irony of the situation when the Honourable Bill Birch told the members, including his parliamentary colleagues, that government could not live with a body that disagreed with it. I was too naive politically to be able to process the fact that the very government that had established a body that was structured to provide independent thinking about possible futures for New Zealand could not cope with the fact that it was in fact doing what it was asked. The Commission for the Future was a bold move by government, but even the fact that it was bipartisan politically did not protect it from the dangers of independent thinking. It was a body established to provide alternative scenarios to assist in planning for the future of New Zealand at a time when our very livelihood and economic survival were at risk. It did as it was asked, but the outcomes, informed albeit by wide public consultation, did not find favour, at least not in those days of first-past-the-post governing. All topics that the CFF engaged in were relevant for future and demonstrate the value of thinking beyond the immediate. Embedding future considerations into current social and political problems is extremely difficult, as that exercise proved. But I would suggest that it's also vital to do this. The future arrives very quickly, as I have found, and some planning and thinking about it will always pay dividends. Thank you very much.